Hello. So, significant updates this week. I think that everyone who has tried the demo has experienced frustration with performance issues. And while I recognize that premature optimization can be the bane of many projects, there's also the fact that building in performant structures early on can save a lot of headaches down the road. So, over the last few weeks, that's been a major focus. Changing how some of the systems, particularly the cloth sim, but also the ship zoning, which we'll get into in a minute here. But there's definitely a lot more to go. But I'm quite curious how these changes are going to affect the performance people see, including in the demo. So I am going to have a update out either today or tomorrow. That is May 3rd, as of the time of recording, for folks to try out if you're so inclined to see if performance is better or worse, or if some unforeseen calamity is going to be affecting things. But I'm hopeful that overall performance will be better. So the first big change is a significant expansion of the zoning system. So while ships in following seas are single root rigid bodies ultimately, they are still comprised of hundreds to, in some cases, thousands of individual meshes and game objects. This is further complicated by having many different lighting zones, all of which are dynamic and all of which are accompanied by a performance cost. One of the ways I've been fighting this in the past is with zoning. Essentially, different parts of the ship are their own individual zones of different resources. But it's pretty limited with how it's functioned previously, and so in this update, I've made some pretty significant changes to it. For example, you can't see my FPS counter, but previously in the scene you're seeing here, I was getting around 45 frames per second, whereas currently I'm getting 144 frames per second. And while this improvement is not going to be universal, my hope is that overall performance will be improved by these changes. So in previous updates, ships were basically just split into an internal and an external space. This has now been expanded into several zones as well as several types of zones. Additionally, these zones have been moved from purely cubic or box type zones to much more precise mesh type zones. This allows for more zones and more precise control over when a player is in a zone or when exactly I want these zones to be drawn. Additionally, non-zones have been created. Essentially, when a player is in a zone, certain objects will stop drawing, such as expensive objects like rigging or cannons, that kind of thing, will stop drawing when a player is below decks, even if it's not reserved to being in a zone. Things like hatches and doors are also part of this zone system, meaning when a entry point to a zone is opened, it will allow the objects in that zone to draw, even if the player is not inside of that zone. This should reduce the amount of pop in, although it shouldn't completely eliminate it. But ultimately, the goal of this is to allow for heavily detailed or cluttered zones to exist without the massive overhead. So typically larger ships like the Satya here will now substantially be cut down in the amount of draw calls happening per frame. This isn't just in meshes, but also expands to things like lighting, shadows, reflections, particle effects. So you'll see hopefully dramatic improvement in performance. For example, the number of meshes drawn or the number of draw calls has moved from a maximum of many thousands, in some cases into the tens of thousands, into generally a few hundred to a few thousand, depending on the circumstance. It's still a fairly high number of draw calls, but the way I have objects in the game set up is by its nature fairly expensive, simply because just about everything is dynamic. There's not a lot of static or batched objects going on, and there are also a lot of meshes as opposed to large combined meshes. But with the meshes themselves being relatively high detail, this means that it's generally easier to resort to aggressive LODs and culling instead of overall smaller numbers of meshes with lower amounts of detail. So ultimately, the goal of this is to improve performance without resulting in dramatic reduction in quality. The next change is going to be an interesting one. The cloth system, by a wide margin, is the most programmatically expensive element in the simulation, and there's only so much that can be done to improve that without cutting the quality to an unsatisfying degree. But this update sees a speculative change that aims to hopefully improve the performance for the majority of people. It's possible that in some cases it will actually make things worse, but my hope is for the majority of people it will be a solid improvement. Regardless, I'd appreciate any feedback for those willing to give it a try. But essentially, the cloth simulation has been moved from a largely CPU-based operation to a GPU-based operation. And additionally, it is now a multi-threaded and asynchronous operation. So in some cases, in all cases, it's going to be dependent on your hardware, but it should dramatically reduce incidences of particle explosions, depenetration loops, or physics death spirals that will result in a crash. Those should be reduced on most systems at the very least. On the Steam Deck, for example, performance with this new solution has gone from essentially a slideshow to being perfectly playable on default settings. But on my main PC, which is a has a fairly powerful CPU, I actually have seen a moderate decrease in performance, although not significantly. So it may eventually come down to being a toggleable option, so that everyone, depending on their hardware, should be able to have improved performance. But it's very much in testing right now. The back end changes are significant. Lots and lots of changes to the code base and the scripting, along with some general optimizations and that kind of thing. So feedback is going to be very much appreciated. And to finish up with a couple of miscellaneous smaller changes. You may have already noticed that I have made the crosshair considerably smaller, as a number of people were not overly thrilled with how it looked. I have changed the operation of the whip staff to be much more precise and predictable. Before, it tended to have a habit of oddly swinging to one side when released. That should be gone now. Hopefully it still feels a bit like a stick connected to a rope. It's not supposed to feel like an incredibly precise instrument or anything like that, but it should feel much more precise ultimately. There's also been quite a few small changes to the meshes of the ships, getting rid of placeholder spheres and aiming to reduce the draw calls of various objects, as some of them were unnecessarily high. And lastly, the reefing UI. I've added a percentage readout, as before it was somewhat difficult to tell exactly where the process was without jumping to the exterior views. So that should be no longer necessary. So anyway, not a lot of new content.